This is the Toulmin model of argument. I was really excited when I found that picture of Toulmin yesterday because he looks really laid back, like he's thinking about the world.
He's got like a tweed
I had to
jacket on.
Yeah, I mean, just look at how sophisticated he looks. So we're about to look at a sophisticated model. And the reason why, there's a lot of reasons why this is worth acknowledging and why it can be valuable with our students. And probably the first and foremost for our purposes is that the Common Core state standards use much of the language of the Toulmin model of argumentation. So they're clearly inspired by that. So just some of the words. This is the English Language Arts Writing Standard number 1 for grades 9 to 10. And I just wanted to pull this out to show you some of the language that I've highlighted. Now this actually has an A through E, but I've only pulled out A through C here. So looking at to write arguments to support claims, that's a big word in Toulmin model. Using valid reasoning, relevant and sufficient evidence. And there's mention of claims again, looking at opposing claims, counterclaims, reasons and evidence, supplying evidence, clarifying relationships. And so all of those words are very, as you see as I go through Toulmin, they're very relevant and related to the Toulmin model of argument. So just to give you an idea of this, at the elementary level, this is that writing standard number 1. So this is the version for grade 4. They use different language. I think Paul mentioned this earlier, but they call them opinion pieces up until grade 6. So to differentiate between the two of those, understanding, developing opinion, and then moving towards more sophisticated argumentation. But, you know, even at the 4th grade level, write opinions with reasons and information, recognize related ideas, supported by facts and details. So those are some of the kind of key words in the Toulmin model. And then for history, social studies, science, and technical subjects, this is that writing standard number 1. Again, focused, now this, in this case, focused on discipline-specific content, and but still looking at claims, alternate or opposing claims, reasons and evidence, data and evidence. So that same language that's repeated. And that's, you know, when Paula mentioned task, purpose, and audience earlier, that's what she's talking about. This is the language that's used in the standards, and it's valuable, I think, to help students become more familiar with that language. So the Toulmin model is, I think, is great for the Common Core and for working with students because Toulmin created this as a way to capture the way that people make arguments in the real world in daily conversations. And so that's kind of the basic idea behind it. It takes into the complications in life and all the times in which we qualify our thoughts and explain ourselves through argumentation. And I had this moment last week. It was actually pretty interesting. And of course, I've been steeped in argument because I traveled to St. Louis last week for a National Writing Project workshop all about argument. And then I was preparing for this session. So I've been thinking a lot about it. But I had this moment, I'm sitting on the couch with my husband. And my husband is not a teacher. So you have to keep in mind that he's getting more and more used to these weird moments that happen. But he's still not totally used to them. But recently, we have been on a Gordon Ramsay kick. And so we're watching 3 different Gordon Ramsay shows because they're available on Hulu and Netflix. So we've been watching Kitchen Nightmares, Hell's Kitchen, and Master Chef. All 3 of them, we just kind of interchangeably watch them. And so my husband, just offhand, and this happens all the time, we'll be engaged in something, thinking about it, something, and we'll say, well, what's your favorite? Or what's your best whatever? So he said, what's your favorite Gordon Ramsay show of the 3 that we're watching all the time? And I told him which one was my favorite, and I wasn't really paying attention, but I talked a little bit about why. And I said, well, what about you? What's your favorite? And he said, well, actually, I think that they are all great, but for very different reasons. And then he started to go into this explanation about why he liked each one of those different shows. And about halfway through his explanation, I grabbed this little sticky note right here to write down what he was saying. He's like, what are you doing? Why are you writing that down? And I was kind of embarrassed. And then finally I said, well, I'm teaching this workshop, and I think this would be a really great example of how people make arguments in the real world. And he's like, well, why are you embarrassed? It's not a big deal. I'm like, I know, but it is kind of nerdy. So he said, I should just be listening to you, right? So he said, Kitchen Nightmares, I really like it because sometimes Gordon Ramsay is nice in Kitchen Nightmares. If he finds somebody that he likes, you're nodding, you know what I'm talking about, he is nice to them. He said, also, it really cracks me up that every restaurant he goes to, they think their food is really great, and that there's something else going on that's wrong. And so he said it's really funny to see then Gordon Ramsay coming in and actually talking about how disgusting their food is and how horrible their restaurant is. So he says there's that element, and then he talks a little bit about why those things are appealing to him. And then he said, I really like Master Chef because that's all about the cooking. All you do is just see people cook food, and there's nothing else attached to that. So you're going to learn a lot about that, and that's really interesting. And he's taken that to heart. In fact, last night he made this pork chops with sweet and sour peppers and onions that he saw in some video from Gordon Ramsay. And my husband doesn't cook anything but eggs. So he's learning about cooking, and that's why it's appealing to him. And then for Hell's Kitchen, he says, I love it because of the drama. I don't care what's happening, but they yell at each other all the time, and Gordon's angry all the time, and this is the reason why that is. And so it was really interesting to me to see how he had constructed pretty quickly this argument about why all three were appealing, backing it up with evidence, and made pretty logical explanation for why. And I think if we think about how often that happens in our lives, we'll see that we do that, and our kids do that too. And so especially early on when we're trying to help set them up for understanding these elements of argument, it's good to engage them in those kinds of conversations and then help them name what they have done. So if I were really nerdy, I would make him go back through and talk about the claims that he made and the evidence that he used to back it up and the explanation behind that. But I didn't make him do that. I just wrote it down on a sticky note. So that's one of the basics behind the Toulmin model. These are the kinds of arguments we make every day when we're engaging in logical, normal conversations. So this is one graphic that captures the different parts of the Toulmin model. So we've got claims, evidence, warrants or backing, qualifications, and rebuttals. And I'll talk a little bit more about all of those things. But I also wanted to show what happened when I did a Google image search for the Toulmin model. And so many different visuals came up of what the Toulmin model looks like. And the reason why I thought I should share that is because the Toulmin model is not a formula for writing an argument, and it's not meant to be. It is having kids consider the different ways that you construct an argument and having them consider all these elements that are named, but not like, start with a claim, then you've got evidence, then you have to have this amount of explanation, and then a paragraph that addresses the opposition. And there's a danger of it becoming a formula when it's really not about that, and that real world arguments aren't a formula like that. So again, here's another version of it with the different pieces to it. And I just want to talk a little bit about the parts. So the first part of the Toulmin model is the claim, which is pretty straightforward, I think. It's a statement of belief based on ideas and should be informed by evidence or data of some sort. Now, this is where it gets tricky, and we're going to work a little bit more with this tomorrow. If you're writing a good claim, it should be both defensible and arguable. And I'll take you through some strategies for helping students make sure that their claims are both defensible and arguable. It answers the question, what? Really the question, what do you think about a particular topic? And again, it should be based on evidence of some sort. It's often qualified in real world arguments so that you would, because you really rarely can say that something is always absolutely true. And in life, we wouldn't say that. So you can use words like often, most of the time, sometimes, usually, to qualify your arguments and make them more solid claims. Then there's data and evidence. And this data evidence answers the question, what makes you say so? So you just answer the question, what do you believe? And then, what makes you say so? So with my husband, it was, what do you think is the best of the three shows? So his claim was, they're all pretty much the same, but for different reasons. And then, if he hadn't jumped right to it, I'd say, well, what makes you say so? And then he would get to specific data and evidence to back it up. Now, it could be statistics and research data, but it can also be anecdotes and examples and stories and quotes. So the idea here is not that we are completely scientific focused, but that it's logical and analytical, like Chris said, so that you're bringing up examples, even if they are examples from your life, but if they're logical and they back up your point, then they still count as evidence. And I was thinking about this, like another experience last week that I had. Like I said, I traveled to St. Louis, and I never watch TV in the mornings or at night unless I'm traveling. And then for some reason, I always turn on the news in the morning. So of course, the big news right now, one of the big news things is the Trayvon Martin case and what's going on there. And it was really interesting. I started to think about the different types of evidence that can be used. One morning when I was just kind of offhand listening, and they said, you know, something's going to come up, there's some big things coming up in the trial that they're expecting to hear that are going to be pretty bad news for the defense if they're true. And the first one is that there may not have been DNA evidence under Trayvon Martin's fingernails. And the second is that maybe his friend, the friend he was on the phone with, heard him say, he's chasing me. And so I started to think about those two different types of evidence and the implications of them, right? So DNA, there's no DNA underneath his fingernails. What's the implication there? There was no struggle or fight, right? So the whole claim was that he shot him because there was a fight and he was trying to defend himself. But if there's no DNA there, usually, and this actually gets us into the warrant, which is the next part of the Toulmin model. General rule would be, if you get into a fight or a struggle, there's going to be DNA underneath your fingernails. And then what about the other one? If he said to his friend on the phone, he's chasing me, what would be the implication there?
He was trying to get away.
That Trayvon Martin was scared of that guy. He was scared of him,
Yeah.
but he was trying to get away from him, because usually if you want to engage in a confrontation with another person, you don't say, he's chasing me because you're fearful. And it occurred to me at that moment how they were just kind of laying that down, but it was a pretty complicated argument that they're making, looking at those two very different types of evidence, one anecdotal and the other scientific, but that both would be considered in court, right? And that they also imply something beyond that, some rule. So so the warrant, which I actually usually call explanation or analysis with my students, because I think they struggle with the word warrant. They get caught up on that, so there's no reason to get too caught up in it. And they don't use the word, actually in the Common Core, it's more about explanation and analysis. The word warrant doesn't appear. So I use those two. Toulmin called it the warrant. But this is where they explain how the evidence supports the claim, and it's based on generally accepted rules. So again, it would be, there's no DNA evidence under his fingers. And it answers the question, so what? This one does. There's no DNA evidence, so what? Well, you would usually think that if there'd been a struggle, there would be evidence underneath his finger, evidence of DNA. If there wasn't a struggle, then he had no need to shoot him and it wasn't self-defense. That part, all that comes beyond the evidence, is the warrant part. It's also the hardest thing for students, I think, and Rhonda and I have talked about that a lot, that they assume that the evidence speaks for itself, and it's really hard to push them to explain the significance of evidence, but it's also the place where they show what they're thinking and why, and so where you can really see the levels to their thinking. So that this is the sense, okay? And there's also, and this is a key part of the Toulmin argument, counterclaims and rebuttals. And this is another thing that makes it all about the real world argument. It's not just about persuading people to agree with you, but that you're recognizing what people might say in response to you, and then you're responding to that. And that's one thing that's not traditionally considered as far as persuasion goes. So the counterclaims just shows awareness of potential audience. It looks at, I don't know why my pictures are in the way, they're not that important. What someone who objects might say in response, and then it includes a response to that objection. So you could be, some people might, this is what I believe, this is what backs it up, this explains how that works, and some people might argue blank, but here's my response to that. So it's a key part of making this logical, analytical argument.